Welcome to This Week in Christian History, a podcast from the Center for Christian History at Mississippi College. The Center for Christian History is dedicated to expanding knowledge and understanding of Christian history. Our mission is to provide a scholarly, unbiased look at the events, figures, and movements that have shaped Christianity over the centuries. You can visit centerforchristianhistory.com for daily historical highlights. And each week on this podcast, we'll do a deep dive into key moments with Christian history's leading authorities. First up on our list of historical highlights for the week is Jesuit priest Jacques Marquette, the first European to explore the northern Mississippi River and the upper Midwest of what was to become the United States. Marquette partnered with Louis Joliet for a 1673 expedition to map the Mississippi River. Their journey aided in confirming that the river flowed south toward what was then called the Gulf of Mexico and not west to the Pacific. On their way, they established missions among Native American tribes. Marquette's missionary efforts were a part of a broader French missionary movement in North America led by the Society of Jesus. On May 18, 1675, Marquette died at only 37 years of age near modern-day Ludington while attempting to return to the mission field. Today, there are geographical landmarks, counties, and even a university named in his honor. Next up on our list, and the subject of our deep dive, is Constantine the Great, Emperor of Rome from 306 to 337 AD. Although it is unclear whether Constantine was a Christian himself, he was considered the first Christian Roman emperor as he legalized the practice of Christianity in the empire. It is said that he had a conversion experience following the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. He attributed the victory to the Christian God, claiming that he saw a vision of a cross in the sky. Later, Constantine made Constantinople into both the empire's new capital and a center for Christianity, and he called the Council of Nicaea. Shortly before his death on May 22, 337 AD, Constantine was baptized, which contributes to the debate over the depth of his faith. Last up on our list of historical highlights for the week is the 80 Years' War, which lasted from 1568 to 1648. At the time, Holland was one of the 17 provinces under Catholic Spain's control. As Holland developed into a Protestant stronghold in the 1500s, it grew resentful of Spanish rule and eventually declared war on Spain in order to gain independence. Thus began the 80 Years' War. William of Orange, the future King of England with Mary II, was the central figure of the Dutch independence movement. On May 23, 1568, the Dutch rebels defeated the Spanish in the first battle of the war, the Battle of Heile-Curlay. This significant victory helped to boost rebel morale. The war resulted in the independence of the Dutch Republic, which became known for religious tolerance and economic prosperity. Today in our deep dive, Nick Walters, founder and director of the Center for Christian History, talks with Michael Haykin of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary about Constantine the Great.
Hello and welcome again to yet another episode of This Week in Christian History, and we are glad to have a repeat performance from Dr. Michael Haykin, who is at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. Dr. Haykin was kind enough to be our podcast guest on our third episode, and so here we are on episode 63. So it's been quite a run, and we are grateful for you have done that for us then, and we're grateful again to see you again today. So thanks, Dr. Haykin, for coming.
It's a pleasure. Yeah, my joy.
Well, we're going to talk about Constantine, and we're using his death date as a way to kind of, as a portal to be able to talk about him. But, you know, it just seems like when you put on the top 10 list or you put on the top high end of the list of things that happen, whether they were kind of tipping points or events or things that Constantine's conversion certainly seems to be way up at the top of that list. Is that probably correct?
Yeah, it definitely is. For the history of Western Christianity, other different contexts, it would not be maybe as important. So, for instance, thinking about Armenian Christianity, Ethiopic Christianity,
Mm.
where the embrace of Christianity by the ruling powers came around the same time, or even maybe a wee bit earlier. But Constantine is a pivotal figure for us as Western Christians, and there's no doubt in my mind that it figures among the top, 10, 12, baker's dozen, whatever.
Right, right. Worth the study and
Oh,
worth
yes.
the. Well, give us some background on Constantine. How did he? Let's talk maybe a bit about his rise to power. If I remember right, his father was a leading figure, right? One of these Caesars or Augustuses or whichever ones they were, right? Whenever Diocletian was dividing the empire up from the Roman Empire, of course, we're talking about.
Yeah, so yeah, the background to Constantine is the chaos of the third century. One of the long-standing questions in Western history, Western historians have debated, the causes for the fall of the Roman Empire in the late fifth century or the early fifth century, depending on when you date it. But the third century is a critical century as well, because to all intents and purposes, the empire should have fallen. Between roughly 220 and 284, you had somewhere in the vicinity of probably around 40 emperors in the space of about 60 years.
Mm,
Um, some of them usurpers seizing part of the empire, etc. All of whom, except for two, died violently, either by assassination or killed on the battlefield. You have massive economic inflation. You have invasions by both the Germanic tribes on the Rhine and Danube frontiers, and then in the Eastern Roman Empire, the ongoing conflict with the Persian Empire, and significant losses there. One of the emperors, Valerian, ending up being captured by the Persians and imprisoned. And when he died in prison in the Persian Empire, excuse me, he was basically stuffed by a taxidermist and stuck in a corner of the Persian king's palace.
wow.
Um, so these sorts of losses or these setbacks were significant. And in 284, a lifer in the Roman army who had worked his way up through the ranks, Diocletian, was appointed or seized power in a coup. And if you'd been living at the time, you'd have thought he'd just be one of another,
Mm,
long list of short-lived emperors. But he reigns until 305, and he begins a reconstruction of the empire along a variety of lines, one of which was his recognition that the empire had become utterly too unwieldy for
mm,
one administrative center to govern. And so he divides the empire logically into the two parts of the Greek-speaking East and the Latin-speaking West. Latin would have been spoken in the East, and Greek to some degree in the West, but those fault lines were probably a good way of administratively dividing the empire. And because the issue at the heart of the issue in the third century was the peaceful transfer of power, he set up an arrangement where there was a emperor in both the East and the West, and a vice emperor, if you want to describe it that way, in
hmm.
both East and West. The emperor was known as the Augustus. Augustus was always a title, and then the vice emperor was a Caesar. So he was the Augustus in the East. Um, Maximian, one of his loyal lieutenants, was the Augustus in the West. And then his Caesar in the East, the man who would eventually replace him. So he had this arrangement that the emperors would at some point step down. This had never been done.
Hmm.
Was a man named Galerius, who had a vicious hatred of Christianity. And then the Caesar in the West was the father of Constantine, Constantius Chlorus. And Chlorus was a nickname meant pale face. So it
Huh.
obviously, most Romans would have been olive skinned because of their Southern European origin. And he obviously did not have the same amount of melanin, I guess, in his skin. And so he was known as pale faced. And so Constantius Chlorus was the Caesar in the West. And so Constantine was raised in a family that was very used to power and ambitious. There's no doubt in my mind that if you read the primary sources that relate to Constantine, either texts that have survived in stone inscriptions or texts that have survived in terms of contemporaries writing about his reign, he was a man who was used to power, desirous of power, etc. And so in the year 305, Diocletian, and by this point he had initiated, probably on the urging of Galerius, a vicious persecution against Christianity. The Diocletianic persecution is the last great persecution of the Roman Church, of the Roman state. And
we just to make for clarity spot, this is part of what we did with our other episode. That's also known as the edict against the Christians sometimes as well, right?
Yes.
As a way to be able, they're synonymous with this Diocletian edict, but it's just to framework that, right? I mean, just
Correct.
to connect that dot. Okay, I didn't mean to stop your mojo.
No,
I just
no,
want to
that's
make
fine.
sure our audience was hanging.
So within 2 years of the persecution beginning in 303, Diocletian announces he's retiring. And he retires to a place called Split, which is in now, I think it's Croatia, and builds a huge palace, which you can still see is now actually a tourist attraction. Maximian has to retire in the West. And then Constantius Chlorus then becomes the Augustus of the West. And he immediately halts the persecution. It rages for another 6 years in the East under Galerius, but in the West it stops in the year 305.
Why was that? Was that because of his wife? Was that Constantine's mother? Or?
Yeah, I think there's good evidence that he was partial already to Christianity. It's interesting, he has among his children one whom he names Anastasia. And Anastasia is a word for resurrection in Greek. And no pagan would ever name his child resurrection. Immortality, which would be Athanasia. Athanasius actually is the male form of that. Well, that's pretty well most of the Greco-Roman pagan world believed in immortality, but it was an immortality of the soul. They were all worldly wise enough to believe that the human body, there's no way the human body once dead gets up and walks around. And so the concept of resurrection was a uniquely Christian concept. So it's intriguing to ask the question, why did he name his daughter Anastasia? The other evidence that we have about Constantius Chlorus also comes from his son, Constantine, who says that of all the emperors who ever came before him, only one of them was not demonized, namely his father. And he is scathing in his attack on the emperors who come before him. He says they're all in hell, except for his father. And so there's the witness of Constantine also, that his father was probably, if not in his own mind, a convinced Christian, at least definitely open to toleration, because there's no real reason why he would have stopped the persecution. The persecution had been framed in ideological terms as a war of extermination of Christianity, which it was described as responsible for all of the turmoil of the 3rd century. And as I said, he stops it immediately.
And the west part that they're living in, is that somewhere near kind of what we would call the Low Countries in Europe today, or is it kind of
no? It includes them, but the West would also include the Roman province of Britannia, which is England, Wales. It would include Hispania, Spain, Gaul, France, the Low Countries, as you mentioned, Italy, and Latin-speaking North Africa, which would
Okay.
essentially be Tunisia, Algeria, and everything west of that.
But home for Constantine would have
Um,
been
his home is basically wherever he is on his military campaigns.
okay. All right. All
In
right.
the fourth century, because of the turmoil of the third century, the center of the Roman Empire is wherever the emperor's tent
Oh,
is.
okay. But is it kind of northwestern Europe, or have I gotten that kind of backwards of where
Yes,
of where Cloris
yes,
would have been? It wasn't
yes,
like in what we would think of as Gaul or France. It wasn't down in Spain. It wasn't over in some. I mean, it was kind of in that
yes. Ultimately,
northwestern
that's his origins. Yeah,
origin about we would be there.
yeah.
Okay. All right. So Constantine decides, right? So he becomes. How does
Yeah, so
Constantine become the?
Constantius Chlorus dies within a year. He dies in the city of York. Eboracum is the Latin name for that town in northern England, or
Mhm.
the northern part of the province of Britannia. And Constantine is with him. And if you go to York, there is a wall in York that I've seen that was originally part of the Roman fortress.
Huh.
And in front of that wall, in the year 306, the legions in Britain, of which there would have been three, declare Constantine the Augustus of the West,
Ah.
which is which is technically an illegal move because there was another individual who should have stepped into the place, who was the Caesar, and Constantine was not the Caesar. Um, so then, over the next 6 years, Constantine is involved in significant warfare on the what is now the European continent, seeking to make real his acclamation to be the Augustus. And the last great battle is fought with a man named Maxentius in outside the walls of Rome. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge is what it's technically known as in 311. And Augustine, 312, sorry. Constantine wins that battle. Maxentius riding his horse with full armor down into the Tiber, drowning. And by that point, Constantine has accumulated a number of Christian advisors, bishops, on his staff.
Hmm.
And he will tell this to his first biographer, Eusebius of Caesarea, that on the day before the battle, he saw a vision in which he saw a cross. Well, he saw a sign in the heavens, which is probably, most scholars believe, the Chi Rho symbol,
Hmm.
the first two letters in Greek of our Lord's name, Christos, which is looks like an X, and then in the middle of it a rho, which looks like a P. It's a very old symbol that was used by Christians throughout the early years of Christianity. And he heard these words, "By this sign conquer." And so his troops when they go into battle the following day, they have on their shields and standards that symbol. And in other words, they go into battle as a professing Christian army.
Hmm.
Now, most of them would not have been Christians, and most of them were being fairly superstitious pagans, because on the Roman standards there would have been emblems of the various gods. There would have been campaign items that would indicate their various campaigns and their history of the specific legion, but there also would have been emblems of their patron gods. And so they were all ripped off and a Christian symbol put on, which indicates to me that Constantine must have been an enormously charismatic figure
Hmm.
to be able, because this is enough for his immediate subordinates to kill him, because they're asking their soldiers to go into battle under the aegis of a religion that had been hitherto heavily persecuted, excuse me, blamed for the ills of the empire, and suddenly now it's in favor with the emperor. And it tells me that either Constantine was a complete fool because that's a politically idiotic move, or he was convinced of the reality of it, and he must have been a charismatic leader. You have these men in the history of the West and probably other parts of the world that I'm not as familiar with, who are just remarkable leaders and can carry by the force of their personality, can foster and engage incredible loyalty on the part of their soldiers. It might be politically incorrect, but Robert E. Lee was such a man during the American Civil War. And I think Constantine was also such an individual.
Well, you're saying that this was a man that other men wanted to follow. I mean, that
Exactly.
he had some moxie, some gravitas, something about him that said, we're ready to get behind this guy. And that probably is maybe also would connect back to these three legions in Britain that would say, you're our guy, right? I mean,
Yeah,
it wasn't like they were trying to, curry favor with his father, right? It wasn't a matter of that because his dad wasn't around, right? Or his
yeah,
dad had already
exactly.
died. So
Yeah,
there had to be
exactly.
something about the guy, maybe like Alexander or others, right? That they just wanted to get in behind him and they could.
Yeah, Alexander the Great is another good example. Here you have the Macedonian army that basically follows him all the way to the frontier of India.
You can watch the rest of Nick's interview with Michael Haykin by clicking the View Full Interviews button on the podcast page of centerforchristianhistory.com. This Week in Christian History is produced for the Center for Christian History by Blue and Gold Media at Mississippi College in cooperation with the MC Department of Communication. For episode transcripts and more information, visit centerforchristianhistory.com. Be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, and follow the Center for Christian History on Facebook and Instagram. Our next podcast episode is coming next week. Thank you for listening.